My name is Peter Heinrich. I'm super excited to be here. And there it is. I'm from Amazon.com, and I'm here to talk about engagement and monetization in the top tier of the apps that we sell in our App Store. I'm a developer evangelist. I concentrate on games, and my experience is based on a lot of game development over a lot of years, and now, for some reason, I'm at Amazon. Of course, one of the questions I get asked a lot with respect to games is, what the heck is the relationship between Amazon and games? I get this question a lot. Well, I usually start by pointing out that Amazon is a very big company. We have lots of different divisions, one of which actually has a lot of ties to the game development community. And in fact, some magazines have even speculated that as much as 55% of all game developers use AWS in some way. Some of our services, S3 or EC2, Elastic Load Balancer, something like that. Of course, we have a reputation for being famously customer-oriented, and so in order to serve these game development customers, we've developed a lot of extra services around supporting them. So that includes distribution, different kinds of ways to monetize, and a bunch of support services that allow them to manage their application development and publishing. And it's in our role as an app distributor or publisher that I want to speak today. We have millions and millions of downloads and in-app purchase transactions that we process all the time. And as well as being customer-focused, we're also very metrics-oriented. And so it's just too good of an opportunity to not analyze all that data that's going by. So what we wanted to do is take a look at all that mountain of data and see if we could identify some predictors or some metrics that would describe for us what might predict a successful monetization strategy. Games that really were really good at converting their customers from non-paying to paying and maximizing the revenue they could generate. Well, of course, the first thing we notice, and I'm sure it's no surprise to anyone, is that IP is on the rise. Freemium is becoming the monetization model of choice, and Gartner is predicting that by 2017, it's basically going to be off the chart, right? Who knows what 2018 is going to look like? But our experience, looking over the last 2 or 3 years, has definitely borne this out. And what we noticed, for some reason, is that there was a small segment of developers in our store that was seeing an incredible rise in IAP conversion above and beyond the rest of the market. So for some reason, IAP was growing, revenue was growing at a much faster rate for this small population of developers. And of course, the big question is, what are those top grossing developers doing differently? Well, it turns out that it's actually really difficult to directly compare applications. So what we did is we turned to a technique that we've used in other situations called cohort analysis, which is based on a behavioral analysis. It's a look at a population termed a cohort that is a group of people that's related in some way by either a shared experience or a particular characteristic. And usually, but not always, it's limited to a specific time period. So an example might be, everybody who had measles at age 9, or pilots of a particular stature who flew for a particular airline during a particular time, or something that might be a little more apropos to our daily lives, which would be, customers. My mic keeps slipping down. Customers who made a purchase within one month or 1 week of a download. So in order to formulate our cohort analysis, we divided our group of customers into two different cohorts based on whether or not they had made a purchase or downloaded a freemium app and then made a purchase afterwards during a certain period. This was March 1st. We split it into two cohorts. One was all the people who had downloaded an application from what we considered the top 50 monetizers. So these are the developers who are right at the top of the list as far as revenue. And we actually eliminated a broad class of applications, which were casino games, because they would skew our results a little too much. We don't have any porn apps, so we didn't have to do that, but I'm sure that would have had a similar effect. And we actually looked at all applications, not just games. It just happens that, for the most part, games are the highest revenue generators. Then we looked at a second cohort, which was basically if you had installed one of these freemium apps from any of the other developers, anybody not in the top 50. And our first theory centered around the idea of active to installed base. So we looked at the number of installed users after 30 days. So we looked at the installation rate and uninstallation rate over 30 days, and we compared that to a similar graph showing the activity of those users who remain installed. So obviously, we thought it stands to reason, it makes sense that the higher percentage of active users you have, the more revenue you'll make. When we factored out the top 50 and just looked at them separately, we found that our hypothesis did seem to hold some water. It's interesting to note that the developers in that top 50 group actually had much higher uninstall rate, actually about 62% more. So people were uninstalling those apps more frequently than the rest for some reason. But the remaining users were significantly more active. In fact, they were about twice as active. And so both of these graphs, are kind of, the activity is a small number when you compare it to the overall population. But if we just go back and forth, you can see that the installed base in the top 50 definitely decreases significantly, but the active bar is rising. So then we pursued another tack. We started looking at time in game. Again, this is just a crude measure of engagement. We figured obviously there's going to be a pretty close relationship. And on day one, we saw that the number of sessions among the active, among the top 50 games was slightly more, and the session time was slightly longer than for the rest of the population. So the total session, or the active time in game, was a little bit more. This grew a little bit over time. So day one, day three, it really kind of peaks at about 25 to 15, and then it slides back over the next few days until after about 30 days it levels out. And what we decided, or what the conclusion we came to, again, not terribly surprising, is that there's clearly a relationship between time in game and revenue, but still we can't draw any conclusions about causation, right? Correlation is not causation. But the results definitely seem to provide evidence that the engagement factor is real, just in case we needed that proof. However, not every observation that we made was totally expected. So, for instance, it wasn't obvious that price and quantity of items that were sold through IAP would be directly related to the engagement. And in fact, these deltas may result from leveraging those engaged users in creative ways. So what we noticed is that on day zero, the number of items that people were purchasing in this top 50 group and the amount that they were spending per transaction was significantly higher than for the rest of the population, about 52% overall for revenue. ARPPU is average revenue per paying user. Day one, this drops back to a little more less crazy number. Day three, it kind of bounces around, and then over time, after about that first 30 days, we settle down to a very respectable 32% advantage for the top 50. How do we explain this discrepancy? Is the item quality that they're selling really enough to account for this difference in IAP transaction amount, or is there some other thing at work here? Are there best practices that we can recommend? Well, going back to the data, we examined the price points across the entire store. And what we noticed is that there was a significant preponderance of items in the 99-cent and $1.99 category. As you can see from these two orange bars on the left, 31% and 29% of the catalog was actually made up of items in these price points. But the revenue generated by those items was significantly lower. So the 99-cent item was actually only accounting for about 14% of overall revenue in the store. Same with $1.99, very small percentage. And what you see is further down that graph to the right, there's some much higher price points that are generating significantly more revenue. So we decided we'd take a look at this from the point of view of the top 50 and see how these numbers shake out. And what you see right away when you factor out everybody else and just look at those top 50 earners is that they seem to have a much clearer sense of how to tune their catalog to provide shelf space, if you will, for the items that are actually generating the revenue. They're much more closely matched. The deltas between availability and revenue are much closer, with the exception of the $4.99 price point. For some reason, people are really excited about selling things for $4.99. They're devoting 13% of their catalog to that price point. Turns out it's accounting for a much smaller portion. So what we found as far as needle movers was that one was engagement, duh. I mean, I think we all know that, right? Which we're measuring in terms of active versus installed ratio and the time in game. But also this IP inventory management pricing factor. So we started looking at the data in a few other ways just to see if we could draw some more conclusions about this. So here we're looking at the first 2 weeks following a download. And what's obviously important about this graph is that there's this huge spike right at the beginning. Again, not terribly surprising that early engagement is critical because of the life cycle of an application. But what we discovered is that if time is money, timing is more money. And it's super critical that you engage your customers early because it turns out that almost 40% of all the revenue that you generate from a customer will happen in the first day. It's critical to keep them in the game because we discovered that almost half of all purchases happen within 1 hour of another purchase. And if you remember from the earlier slide where we showed that the typical session was about 2 to 3 minutes, what does this mean? This means that people are obviously playing multiple sessions in a day. They're playing multiple sessions within 1 hour. And it's critical to keep them engaged and keep your game or application top of mind so that they continue to return to it and are in a position to make that second and third and fourth purchase. And then third, it's critical to give them, obviously, a reason to come back. 64% of your revenue comes from those third, fourth, fifth purchases, and almost 3/4 comes after the first week. So you want to make sure that you have something compelling that draws people back to your application. Over half actually comes after the first 30 days. So despite the fact that there's a rapid fall off of user engagement over time, obviously, if you can keep them longer, you'll make more money. One way to keep them longer is actually to provide much more selection. So we saw a direct correlation between the number of items in the store, the offerings in the catalog, and the average revenue. And it's important to understand that a very, very small slice of your user base, just over 1%, actually accounts for about 1/3 of your sales. We also found that as a user becomes more comfortable with the application, they also become much more comfortable making purchases there. And in fact, their price sensitivity declines over time. So this stands to reason, right? If you're playing a game, for instance, and you have the opportunity to purchase crystals or boosts or power-ups or something, you may find that when you first install the game, you're not especially comfortable with forking out the $4.99 at the $4.99 price point. Maybe you just want to give it a try. It's an unknown quantity. You spend 99 cents. But if you've been playing that game or using that application for a month, then at the end of that time, you have a much clearer sense of exactly what you get for your money, how much money you need to spend to achieve what you want, And it turns out that people who spend time with your game are actually willing to pay up to 60% more for the in-app purchase items after that 30 days has passed. So they're clearly more comfortable with the purchasing in your application once they become more comfortable with the application itself. We also found that it's important to offer variety, but you don't want to offer too much variety. The more price points you have, you'll see this drop-off in revenue and conversion. And we think that's because you may simply be overloading the user, just making it a little too confusing. They're not quite sure exactly what the differentiation is between the value proposition between items. But we found that the sweet spot right now is between 1 and 5 price points. So lots of variety in your store, just don't price them all over the map. Have some very clear tranches where you place the prices, and you'll prevent confusion in the user. So based on these observations, we took a stab at trying to establish some best practices that we saw across the board among these top 50 developers. First, it's really critical that you actually show users, whether it's a tutorial or a manual or some kind of additional information that you present in a creative and fun way on how to make purchases in your application. We found that of the applications that we looked at, the ones that provided a way to a tutorial to explain how to make a purchase within the application boosted their conversion by about 150%. So they were making about 2.5 times what other applications were making. It's also really helpful if you provide a way to, if you explain how to redeem these purchases once you've made them. So you purchase your crystals or your additional level pack. If you have a tutorial or some kind of instruction to show how to use those once they've been purchased, you can increase your conversion rate by about 65%. Also can't overstate the simplicity of the store, a clean store, usually something with tabs or panels. Those are the kinds of in-app purchase experiences that people respond to best. And they typically raise the average revenue per paying user by about 75% over the rest of the store, the average. And finally, as I mentioned, it's critical to tune your catalog, make sure that you balance those prices against the availability in your store, make sure that there's a good balance and that you're not providing too many items in the wrong price points. Again, because of the price sensitivity declining over time, make sure that you have high value or higher priced items in your store so that the people who become comfortable with your application actually have something to purchase. It's also really important to provide additional items over time. So we found that a lot of the applications that we looked at tended to refresh their catalog on a regular basis, whether it was additional level packs or more power-ups or that kind of thing. And every time you do that, it generates a little bump in your revenue. So there's really no limit to the number of items you can add to your store to keep people engaged and keep it fresh. And I just wanted to reiterate that the number of price points is significant. So the smaller number of price points you have, the less confused the user will be and the easier for them to purchase. So just as a quick conclusion, I'll do a little review of our cohort analysis and the inferences we drew from it. IAP is completely accepted, and it's only going to grow. Obviously, engagement as a measure of, or as measured in time in game, has a direct correlation to revenue, and maybe unintuitively, players are actually perfectly happy to spend more on higher price items. It's important to to balance your catalog so that they have access to those, and obviously repeat customers are critical to your success. So one way to drive repeat purchases is to increase your selection. So the best practices that we derive from this analysis, obviously make engagement your #1 priority. I think we're here because we recognize that gamification is one of the primary mechanisms to do this. We also want to show players how to make IAP purchases, how to redeem those items after their purchase, and make sure that you actually present those items in a visually appealing and easy to understand way. And then tuning your catalog is critical. That's it. Brief. I'll be on the side if you have any questions afterwards. And thanks for coming.